Didn't work. I'm recording now. Okay, I thought I'd be able to know how to do that by now. It is recording now. Okay, so we are at Platonic Academy of Melbourne, Plato's Republic, summer 2021, and it's week 6, our last week, from democracy to tyranny and the myth of So welcome everyone for our last session. I hope you've got your favorite tipple standing by for the the last half hour or so, our discussion. Just a couple of announcements. We were talking about the geometry, which Demetra, because of her monumental accident, couldn't make it this time, so she's coming next time. So that's on after Easter, as well as a new dialogue, a dialogue that we haven't read at the Platonic Academy before, called Theaetetus. And I'm very keen to do that because I remember when I was young, it was absolutely my favorite dialogue. I think it's wonderfully written, wonderfully engaging, and it's all really around the question of what is it to know? So, if that general philosophical question interests you, then I definitely recommend coming to that. It's an engaging dialogue, so I think people will enjoy it, and really like a great entree to philosophy. I would say to kind of like the mainstream question of epistemology in our tradition. So if you are interested in that, come along to that one. And yeah, do recommend to other people if you enjoying the course, because we don't have much advertising going on. Now, the bad news is that there's been a bit of illness around. I've been reading about it in the paper, politicians and stuff. And Demetra, but she's here, that's great. But Maria is ill today. So she was going to present the myth of her. So all you got is me, I'm afraid, unless someone else wants to have a bit of a go and fill things in. I'm not great on the myths, and but I've cobbled something together just to, and hopefully you guys have read it, and we can just all indulge in it a bit, maybe around the time we're having a drink. So what I'll do today is I'll go back over this, just revise the education program thing of the educational philosopher thing, and talking about dialectic there from last week. And then we can go into this week's reading about, or the general topic of imperfect societies. I called them bad ones last time, but imperfect, not perfect societies. And particularly the reading that you guys did, if you just did the reading, which was about democracy and it devolving into tyranny. And then there's the final book, which is acts as a bit of an appendix. And this is where it starts off as a kind of like a justification or elaboration on this issue about why there shouldn't be poetry or poets or certain types of poets poetry in the Republic. So he talks a bit more about that and representational art and stuff. And then we kind of, he slips into this discussion of immortality, and then into this myth. Just go straight into this myth, and that's the myth of Earth. So, and I was just saying, Anastasia, if you've just joined us, hi, and everyone.
Good evening.
Others who have just joined us, that that Kathy put up on our Facebook page. I linked to a YouTube reading of the myth of which has some lovely visuals as well. So I'm going to put that up on the resources page with the recording of today's session. And so if people want to sit back with a glass of wine, or maybe not, a cup of tea, and watch that one after this class, it might be a nice way to round off our lovely indulgence in one of the greatest books of our tradition. All right, so let's get going today. So so we'll just remember this education program, and this special education program, we'll remember, is all about, and this is where he actually uses the language, turning around the mind's eye. Um, it's about you know, not turning around, not turning away from the senses necessarily, but it does involve spending some time, if you like, we might think in meditation, where you kind of don't pay attention to the senses, and you enter this realm of pure form, and you can imagine that as you will in your own experience. And he starts off with this education program saying, well, you know, that we've got to start off with the one science that embraces them all. And this science is arithmetic, which I'm sure at that time was quite surprising, and surprising, probably still surprising today. And then when he starts giving an account of this arithmetic, he talks about the logistic, which is like applied arithmetic, which is what the military person uses, or the farmer or whoever else uses to count the cattle, or, you know, to work out if there's you know, enough you know, potatoes on each plate and that sort of thing. Calculation, multiplication, division, subtraction, and adding, that's all logistic. And the arithmetic is this higher science that is very much in itself in the realm of the form. It's not to do with any particularity. That's its application in logistic. And then he retreats from that to the essence of arithmetic, and the essence, therefore, of all the sciences, which is the elementary origin, the one. And so this discussion here is one of the places that's very important for the tradition in Platonism and Neoplatonism of the monad, it gets to be called, or the one, the original one, the principal one. Now, and he says, look, don't be mistaken. This is not like some ordinary one. It is the one that is always seen at the same time with its opposite, that it seems to be no more one than its opposite. So that's, if you want to have a look at that important section, I think I read it out last week, that's at 524E. And so, you know, hopefully now you're rewarded by the fact that I have talked about this one quite a bit, even in the introductory class, and this notion of one also having its opposite, and the same and the other is in the same, and the not one or the none is in the one. So it's a special way of understanding oneness in general. He explains this through introducing formal opposites. So we get the whole thing here, really. And so it is an important section if you want to really understand what's going on in Platonic formalism. Remember, he talked about the three fingers. I think he used these three smallest fingers. And he talked about thickness and thinness, softness and hardness, and things like that. And let me just go into that a little bit. So, you know, if we just think of softness, right? And softness, it's soft, not hard. But when we think about this, we naturally just work in different contexts, thinking about softness in different degrees, if you like. So if I get a cappuccino and it's got a froth on the top, it could be very soft or quite thick and hard. So, or we could talk about the softness of an avocado when we kind of press it to see if it's right. Or like a runner could be saying, oh, I like running on bitumen rather than concrete because it's soft. The road's soft. So, of course, we're using different scales of softness and hardness here. There's froth softness and there's road softness. Each time we draw the line in different places, on this kind, we can think of it as kind of like a spectrum that in a way goes forever. So hard, not soft, remains the same in its formal essence. Harder is never softer, like taller is never shorter, but taller not shorter. Itself stays the same as itself. And then there are these different formal absolutes unto themselves, taller and shorter, harder and softer, heavier, not lighter, harder, not softer, taller, not shorter. We still know what softer means no matter where we draw the line. Softer, not harder, opposites stay the same no matter where we draw the line. So if we kind of understand this difference, then for one, it's easier to read Plato when he talks about this stuff. But it also does point to an important thing about the difference between a form, especially an opposite form, and its participation. So while Simius can participate shortness beside basketball size Phaedo, and then Simius can, you remember in the Phaedo, and Simius can also participate tallness beside little Socrates, but tallness will never be shortness, even though Simius can participate both. So there's the form and then its application. In this case, we can think of putting the mark in. We put the mark in. We say, you know, that's not a soft avocado because we've defined what softness is, that sort of thing in its context. Okay, and so there's a similar thing going on with the one here, and I hope you can see the similarity. I'm just going to share the screen now, if I get it up. Okay, I'm a bit slow off the mark here today. All right. If you can't see the slide, then let me know. Okay. So he says at one point, the one itself is never divided. And, you know, we've been talking about, you know, the emanation of the one and being a bit like division. So it's a little bit confusing here with the language, but let me just put this way. The one itself is never divided. Only things that we call one are divided. When we quarter something or call one part 1/4, this means that one is now applied to the part, right? So first of all, we called the whole one. And now when we're talking about 1/4, I had 1/4 of the pizza. We're talking about one applied to the quarter. Okay, so one itself is never divided in these things, but things that we call one are divided. So in both these cases, with those opposites, harder and softer, and with this one is not divided, it's trying to point to the difference between the form and its participation. Okay, so I might keep the slides up because we can now go straight into the hierarchy of the sciences, which we dealt with last week, I hope you remember. And the hierarchy of these sciences is in terms of, if you like, the dimensions. So the study of the one is very important, right? You know, and it's like so simple, but so important. And that's why I've been stressing it here. And that's why Neoplatonism and Platonism will stress it as the tradition goes on. And then there's the first dimension, which he gives as the alternation of the odd and even. So the alternation of the opposites, which we can count then as odd, even, or count them as 1, 2, 3, 4, and use that in logistics. And then we've got the plane geometry, the geometry of plane figures. So that's a science that needs to be taught. And then after that, solid geometry, so the geometry of solids, and then the geometry of moving solids. So what he calls astronomy. Now, the discussion doesn't proceed exactly in this order, and he jumps over, for example, solid geometry to emphasize a lack of interest in it, and actually also to hint at that the Academy is doing investigations into that. And we do believe that the Academy did make advances in the study of solid geometry from the hints we get within Plato itself, especially in the Timaeus, and from subsequent writings. Now, in astronomy, Plato wants to emphasize that what he calls astronomy is not astronomy per se, but the mathematics behind astronomy. When he says look up, he doesn't mean look up literally at the sky. He says look up with the soul, or looks up towards the forms. The difference is as per with the divided line between the visual and the intellectual, or my looking up and looking down thing. In this case, the looking down would be doing astronomy, if that's not confusing things too much. Astronomy as in sensible astronomy. So he's really talking about the mathematics behind astronomy. So we know astronomy as a mathematical science, you know, astrophysics, physics, we know it as a mathematical science, but of course it was pretty much being invented as a mathematical science then. Prior to that, it was kind of symbolic. It was, you know, certain talking about certain gods and their motivations and everything, and Platonism played a major role in turning it into a mathematical science. And he's really pushing the mathematics behind the astronomy. Sort that out and then do your astronomy. And then within astronomy, he there's this other science. Oh, so there's Platonic solids, and I think maybe I showed this last week how viruses is very topical, and how the electron microscopes find how geometric viruses are, and that's the 5 Platonic solids that have remained important in solid geometry and physics ever since. Okay, so then he also talked, so from astronomy, the science of moving bodies, he classes within that music, because that's also moving bodies, right? So acoustics is recognized as a physical science. Now, this was even before Plato, actually. This was a big breakthrough of the Pythagoreans. We're not sure exactly when. It was attributed later to Pythagoras, but it probably happened in the generation before Plato, where they actually recognized, they recognized from the visual wavelengths in a piece of string how that related to the musical sound and how they harmonized with each other. So to go up an octave, you cut the string in half, and the fifth is in the ratio of 2 to 3, and the fourth is in the ratio of 3 to 4. That sort of thing. It's all about ratios, and that was part of astronomy as well. Okay, but then, as we might remember last week, there was Glaucon said, wow, like this is a lot of science, Socrates, this is going to take a long time to teach. And then Socrates responds, well, what? That maths is only a prelude to the real study that these guardians have to undertake. So maths is not enough. A mathematician can be a good mathematician, but still not find reward, still not, turn around to the noetic realm, turn around properly, okay? It is dialectics that brings this all together. It finds the common relationship, the common relationships between things, how things relate to each other. So only dialectic can take you to this very higher realm. But what is it exactly? Just a discussion or something more specific? Now, if we remember, we go back to the divided line, and he does return to this in the discussion here. We find that dialectic is the only practice. It's kind of a particular type of dialectic. It's a higher dialectic that can operate in the far right region. So remember, geometry is kind of bridging between the sensible and the formal but of sciences that can just work only in the dialectic realm, only in the insensible pure realm of the forms, he says dialectic is the practice. So in this section, Logos grasps by the power of dialectic, using hypothesis to go as far as the unhypothetical first principle of everything. The unhypothetical first principle of everything, which is identified with this higher one, which then if you've done any Platonism, becomes known as the monad, using no sense perceptions, but forms themselves, going through forms to forms and ending up at the forms. So that's 511b. Now, on around page 532, Socrates is really coy about this. And remember the passage. Remember I read out the passage on 533 A to C. You won't be able to follow me, he says to Glaucon. It's about the absolute real, but it may be beyond knowing and beyond being. Like let's not even talk about whether it really is. Only those who have experienced it can practice this dialectic, right? Which is kind of like a catch-22, isn't it? You know, how can you get there to experience it? And you know, if you can't use the dialectic to experience it. It is the reality of everything that geometry can only dream about. So kind of geometry's been putting in, hey, that's just a prelude, you know, that is just getting you halfway there. You know, you're still asleep, you're still dreaming, you're not awake to the pure essence of the forms until you practice this dialectic. Geometry makes hypotheses, but this higher dialectic, is about destroying hypotheses, therefore proceeding to the first principle of everything. So what's this dialectic mean? What's it doing? It's operating in the pure forms, not referring to particular things. So you would just be talking about equality and inequality, same and other. You could talk about justice and injustice as well, and things like that are not referring to particularities, greater, smaller, things like that we've been talking about, the pure forms. And actually, Plato, as I said last week, Plato does have some very specific ideas about this. And it's quite clear they're suggested here and then practiced in later dialogues, particularly the Sophist and the Parmenides. And so I will say that the Theaetetus we are going to be reading next time, hopefully as a prelude to the Sophist. If we're up to it, not sure we will be, because one follows the other. Theaetetus is inconclusive, but then this higher dialectic is addressed at the end of the Sophist. So it kind of leaves it all elusive, but there is some follow-up if you want to read these later dialogues. But anyway, that's where the Republic kind of reaches its climax when it's talking about all this. And the rest is a bit of a denouement, really, and an appendix. The next discussion, finally it's been deferred, is about the imperfect societies, with evolution in them. And then he kind of comes back to the issue of the banning of poetry, and then concludes with justice in this world and the next with the myth of Ur. So we're kind of coming to the end now. We're coming to the end of the account of the Republic, and with the final statement about the higher education of the guardians. So before we go on to the imperfect societies, are there any questions, comments, or reflections on this section, or on anything so far, really, in the Republic? Because we've now gone through 9 books. Okay.
Bernie, I don't know if this has been covered before, but in that higher dialectic, does that include the ideal? the ideology, like the ideal.
So the higher dialectic, you know, he's just really giving a really broad description of it, is a discourse that is reflecting on or discussing the forms in themselves. So we've talked about today and other times these forms of greater and smaller, of same and other, of one and none, equal, unequal. You remember like, unlike, equal, unequal, that sort of thing. And so, you know, when you go and read the Parmenides or the last part of the Sophist, it's pretty full on. It's all it's talking about, you know, and you can't sort of, you get a bit lost because you can't kind of pin the discussion down to anything concrete. But this is where you're supposed to be able to, you know, get to a vision, this higher vision of how everything comes together, if you like, how everything is one, how everything is one. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that help? Yeah. Any reflections in general on the Republic? Was it as people expected?
I expected to agree with him, but I don't think I agree on many things or some things. And he goes on a lot about tyranny, and that was an endless section. It was a lot.
Yeah. Well, you know, childhood experiences, the rule of the, what's it called? The 30 tyrants or something was in his youth in Athens. It was a fairly brief period. And some of his family was involved on both on the side, were one of the 30 tyrants. So yeah, I think it definitely had a big influence on him. And of course, the misgivings of democracy. It was a very direct democracy, and had some issues with that, as we've already discussed. But we'll get onto that. We'll get onto that soon.
For me, I find it was difficult for me as living in this century of how it was all those millennia ago. So we have our thoughts and our way that we're living, and I find it difficult to be in that space. So I sort of almost need to be transported back to get into that mindset of what it was like. You're on mute.
Do you find some of the things he talks about have universal application though, Kathy?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Yes. But the mindset is different to how I feel we as a society live in terms of equality, in terms of, oh, well, yes, I guess we can open all of that too. It isn't equal, yes. Yeah, we have those issues.
Yeah, we have a strong aspiration or kind of ideology of egalitarianism, don't we? Which he's not professing there. It was probably there a bit at his time, in terms of free people, free citizens of Athens, supposedly being equal. We have this ethos of egalitarianism now, but you know, I mean, let's face it, isn't it funny how we have that ethos that everyone's equal? And quite clearly in our society, it's not the case. There's some very powerful people, and there's some very powerless people.
I mean, he does also point towards imagine if slaves were, that sort of when he sort of refers to the potential anarchy that could come. Imagine if, the anarchic society that we would have if slaves were equal, if women had the same, rights as men. He sort of lists the whole. And you're kind of going, no. So it's hard to sort of follow him in that sort of in the arguments that he's making there. I sort of understand the point that he's trying to make, but again, as Kathy sort of mentioned, we are coming at it from our modern viewpoint, and it's I guess it's difficult to separate our perspective to leave to incorporate the sort of the historical perspective, I guess, that's required to maybe have a greater appreciation of what's being said. But certainly the what I've gotten the most benefit from what I've had the greatest pleasure in reading is the allegorical section of the Republic. I found that.
It is the enduring section, and it's in a way it's kind of it exists and is of interest other than the utopian project, isn't it? So yeah, okay, so people are sort of getting into the imperfect society and can see we're imperfect societies. I can see then that we're eager to get to that discussion. So let's do it, and let's see if we can find something that we can take away and not just say, oh well, that was his time. And, it has no relevance to us. Maybe there is some stuff that's of interest and universal to us. So this discussion actually began back in book 5. Socrates brings it up, and then there's these huge digressions. Like there's digression about women and family. There's question, well, you said this thing about women being equal and stuff, and families being common. What's going on there? And then I think it's a whole book on the discussion around family and male, female, and so on, which is quite interesting. And then there's the digression about the education of the philosopher, which we all find really interesting and is one of the most enduring parts of the book, which we're just now coming out of. So he's come out of that, and now we go back to this thing about imperfect society, so that he can talk about those and say what's wrong with them. But interestingly, you talk about them in this sense that one leads to another, and the particular devolution that's of interest to us perhaps is from what he says about democracy to tyranny. Now, it's I find one part of it a little bit confusing. There's one society called Timarchy, it's believed to be sort of modeled on Spartan type military society. Then there's oligarchy, so wealth-based, powerful, wealthy people lead. And then there's democracy with an emphasis on liberty, freedom, the victory of the poor in a way. So the poor have a voice, whereas they normally wouldn't. And then there's tyranny, which unleashes the base desires, including unleashing eros, which is quite interesting, and bad according to Plato. The fifth is, or the first, is kingdom or aristocracy, and somehow this aligns with philosopher ruler, and I think that's a little bit confusing. Maybe someone can clarify that one for me. And he describes it in terms of a devolution from aristocracy all the way down to democracy, which is at the second bottom, and eventually tyranny, which is the worst. Okay. It is as though there is an almost natural process of corruption or devolution that you have to work against if you want to build your utopia. That's certainly the implication. And there's also a psychosocial alignment here. There is a personality type associated with each type of government. I don't know whether that was obvious in the section that you read, but if you read if you're interested in the political stuff, it's a great read to read right through. And he talks about personality types associated with different types of government. So if we focus now on democracy and on your reading, it's about liberty and freedom of the people. And it starts to unravel due to a culture of disrespect for authority. This unraveling leads to an anarchy. And then there's this swing to opposites, right? Overdoing one thing usually brings about a great change to the opposite. So the theme of opposites arrives even here. And this oscillation is a general rule, and it's like the seasons. So he says this on page, around page 564. So great liberty of democracy brings on the great subjugation of tyranny. And this is kind of how it works. The anarchy develops. The wealthy step in to bring order in the anarchy, but they are accused of being oligarchs. You know, these oligarchs are taking over, what's going on. Indeed, the reaction of the people causes them to behave like oligarchs. So the people, to call them oligarchs, they start behaving like oligarchs. And then in reaction to this, there is kind of a populism. A people's hero emerges. A people's hero is thrown up, and that hero evolves into a tyrant. The tyrant clamps down harder and harder, purges his lieutenants, instigates war, and well, also instigates on his people tyranny. So that's my little summary of that. I know people have already expressed interest in this. How do people find that reading? Any reflections? Any reflections on politics since then? I'm thinking Roman Empire. You know, the democracy, and then it turned. You know, this is well after Plato, and then they went from democracy to having Caesar's emperors. Yeah, again. But also maybe in more recent politics as well. So yeah, any comments, questions, or reflections on that?
Is he saying that excess, any type of excess, like you know, chasing wealth in an oligarchy or an excess of freedom in a democracy, any type of excess will lead to bad things?
Yeah, that's kind of a general rule in Plato, really. There's important excesses that he doesn't like. So it's letting the base passions, desires, emotions loose, run wild. We've done the 3 parts of the soul, haven't we? I think we've done it here and elsewhere. Yeah, where in terms of the soul, that the base passions need to be controlled by the thumos, the spirit or something. So reason's in control, and so reason being in control is very important. We're talking about the music last night in geometry, where, you know, Pythagorean music was all about staying calm. You didn't have discordant notes, you know, the notes that we all love, really, when in the music that get us excited. No, it's all got to be calmed down. And in terms of the politics, Bulla, remember the what is justice, you know, and we get this answer, well, it's just minding your own business and doing your own thing. So, you know, not too much freedom, and you know, no excessive freedom. Yeah, do your own thing, and don't be a busybody with criticizing the guardians, for example, about their government. So yeah, I think it's pretty much a general rule: avoid excess, which a lot of people, by the way, since have reacted to, including Friedrich Nietzsche in the famous 19th century philosopher. He railed against this approach.
Can I ask something, Bernie? Has the democracy that Plato suggests, is that the same democracy that we in the Western world understand to be?
Well, as we've been saying, their democracy was much more direct and much smaller. So you had slaves, and you had women who had no power. So if you're talking about the democracy, you're talking about the free citizens in the city-state, probably really only the ones from wealthy families, and there was a very direct democracy amongst them. Which we don't have. We have greater complexity and much less democracy. When you think about it, we think we have democracy, but what is it exactly? Well, we vote every 4 years or something. We vote at different levels of government, but we have a lot of people appointed to roles in our society. Like you think of the public service, you think of the judiciary. There's lots of parts of our society that are run, organized, managed, where there's meritocratic systems of power, or of course, where people succeed in business and then are very powerful, like media owners and things like that. So yeah, does that answer the question? I think he is talking about a more direct democracy situation than what we have, and obviously a much smaller one. The city-state, I mean, just about everyone would have known everyone else. It would have been very small.
Thank you.
Talking about democracy and freedom and stuff like that, it reminds me of a trip I took to the States a few years ago after a very long time having not been in the States. And I was absolutely stunned by the messages of freedom and liberty that are, written on top of buildings and perpetuated in a really visible way, and on TV programs and stuff like that. And even outside the White House, there was someone was demonstrating, which I thought was an inappropriate thing. And I asked the officer there, and he said, it's freedom. You're allowed to, say and do what you want on this site. And I was quite taken aback by it, because we don't see those messages in our society visibly. I've not seen them anywhere else where I've been anywhere. I was quite amazed and also taken aback by the contradiction where those messages are out there, but the society, lots of American society and groups are hindered by lack of freedom due to other influences. So it was a bit of a contradiction, but the messages were these types of messages, and they're really prominent.
Yeah, I mean, it's very striking compared to us. Like, I just, think perhaps it's reflected in the response to COVID. I don't know, but, like when they introduce seatbelts, it's that whole thing. When they introduce seatbelts, they say it's a law, or they introduce the metric system, or you introduce the no smoking stuff. We in Australia, we're all sort of going, oh, we're all compliant, and we all, and then you go to Scandinavian countries, and it is even further. People are quite willing in Sweden, from my experience, to accept limits on their freedom for the greater good in extraordinary ways. And then you go to the US, and there's, the ethos of egalitarianism in this country is similar to the ethos of freedom in the US. And of course, there is the other parallel that is difficult to avoid, which is the discussion of the oligarchs. There's anarchy, and then the oligarchs come into power, and you think of that as the Washington elite, which is also a financial elite as well. And then Trump raging against that in his popular movement, draining the swamp or whatever. So, you know, when you're reading that part, I must say, and I am the first person to bring up Trump, you know, like you just sort of think, wow, the oligarchs, you know, and Hillary Clinton being personified as the you know, as the establishment, and then the populace coming through and smashing that down. They don't have tyranny, by the way, now, but you could see how that could be a potential path, and a path that did, I don't know my Roman history very well, but that did seem to follow in Roman history, which was like 400 or 500 years after Plato. But he does seem to be pointing to something of a pattern, I think.
I was doing some reading on the weekend about North Korea, and not that I know too much about North Korea, but I was interested to see that its proper title is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and there's nothing democratic about it whatsoever. And, you know, right down to their voting system. If you don't vote the way they want you to, there's no secret voting. If you scratch off the one and only candidate whose name appears on the ballot card, you're singled out. And
yeah. Yeah. And does anyone remember the name of East Germany? That was called the German Democratic Republic, wasn't it? And you can also look at revolutions, you know, like French Revolution, Cuban Revolution, the Russian Revolution, where there's this attempt to introduce democracy, perhaps, or the rule of the people, which then, for various reasons, and perhaps the reasons that Plato suggests, or perhaps for other reasons, you turn into a very, you know, perhaps it turns towards what we call totalitarianism, but might be similar to well, yeah, it's a tyranny, isn't it? So yeah, we can sort of see that pattern in a similar way, I think, you know, in various historical situations.
I also reflected on that. There's a beautiful passage that says, anyone who tastes human blood becomes a wolf. And I thought of, you know, people who come into power and taste that power over others, how they become tyrants or can become tyrants.
Mm. Yep. Yep. No, I do remember that. That's a nice little passage there. Yeah. Okay. All right. I might just keep going because I want to stop for a glass of wine for the final chat. So I'll get into book 10. So the final book. And it's a bit of an appendix, a clarification on the rule on poetry, and then finishes with this some turn into talking about immortality and the myth of, well, turning around to talking about justice and retribution for the unjust, and then to the myth of So the first thing is quite interesting and quite different from the myth of where he's talking about art as imitation. So there's the form of things, and then there's particular things, and then there's their appearance, and the artist represents their appearance. So he gives this idea of, you know, like if you've got a table there, you know, it's not drawn square, it's drawn from the perspective of where the artist is looking at the table. So it's the appearance of the table that's drawn. And then there's the table itself, which is a particular expression of the forms. So the artist is 3 parts removed. Now, if the whole object, right, certainly the Guardian's education, is to turn around and directly gaze at the forms, then these artists, right, are tending you the other way to the appearance of particular things. They paint, if you like, when he's talking about painting, they paint a representation of the appearance of particular things, rather, which is looking the wrong way, not looking at the form. So, you know, it's a bit like the music and everything having to be all calm. You know, you think, well, you know, can't you enjoy the art? But no. So, and then he moves this. He moves towards, and he keeps dipping in and dipping out to the poetry, to tragic poetry, and but early on he gives this little coda. He says, but you know, like, don't get me wrong, I have a love and respect for Homer since my childhood, but man mustn't be respected above truth. That's at page 595C, if you want to go back and have a look at that. The poet describes all sorts of things, war, crafts, you know, all these sort of things, and tends to be an authority in this cultural education for these things. But really, all they're seeing and all they're representing is the appearance. So the appearance of the craft, what it looks like, not the actual truth of how this thing is done. And another problem is that the poets represent the higher passions. They tend to not to show restraint, because for a start, you know, it's easy to portray the higher passions, the tears, the shouting, the conflict and everything, but it's much harder to show when someone's being restrained. And also, it's what the audience wants. You know, they want the high drama, and the high drama stirs up the emotions. Whereas what we want is models for reason and restraint. So that's around page 605AB. And what's interesting around this passage, around actually around the beginning of 606, is I kind of felt that he talks about having a good cry when you're going and watching one of these plays. And so I'm sort of thinking, yeah, that's right. People, you know, think of all the, you know, I don't watch them so much, but think of all the high drama, intense detective stories and whatever, you know, drama on television or movies, which involves watching a lot of suffering, involves watching people going through serious trauma and everything. Well, he talks about this, and he talks about that as being a bad thing, not, and at the having a good cry when, you know, there's some drama in, you know, in the play, in the Odyssey or whatever, not as a cathartic release at all for the audience, but actually as pretty much a bad thing. It just shouldn't. You shouldn't. He sees it more as enjoying the suffering of others. Interesting. So we should only allow hymns to the gods and eulogies to good men. Says that at page 607. But not long after that, there's this quick shift in the dialogue to the immortality of the soul. And it turns around this kind of reflection on what was going on in book 1 and 2. If you can remember Thrasymachus putting up that argument that the unjust get all the rewards. It's better to be unjust, right? And in fact, that the laws and ethics of society, like the ideology, it's a bit like Marxism, bourgeois ideology, is all orientated to benefit those that are in power. Now, in book 2, then Glaucon then says, well, Socrates, I want you to make a better case for justice. You kind of beat Thrasymachus in the argument, but I wasn't really convinced. Make a better case for justice. And here I'm going to give you this scenario where someone is just but appears unjust, right? They appear unjust, and so they don't get all the rewards and attributes. You know, oh, you're a just person, I'll give you a medal, I'll give you a pat on the back, you're a nice person. You get all the rewards for that. That just being just is inherently good in itself. So remember, Socrates had to argue against that. And that's when he went into discussing the Republic. So we've kind of come back to that. And Socrates now says, well, the reward of the unjust is actually superficial and not sustained. These rewards they get, you know, doesn't really make them happy in the end, sort of thing. And you get an instant reward, but there might be remorse down the track. But this is not only in this life, but also in future life, where in the afterlife, where, so in this life and in the afterlife, the just, in fact, are rewarded. And so this is when he slips into the myth of and this is when Maria was going to give her spiel about this. And what I'll do is I'll just give a bit of an outline of this myth, and I'll put up an image there, and we can talk about it a bit more, because some people in this group might be able to fill in some of the bits. So dies on I think dies on the battlefield, but he not actually dies. He was out for 10 days and wakes up on his funeral pyre and tells the story of what happened. So a near-death experience story. He talks about Judgment Day. He talks about punishment and reward. He talks about a 1,000-year journey into the underworld, to hell. There's even something about limbo for babies who die young. There's cycles of birth and rebirth, and cycling up when you have a good life and cycling down when you have a bad life. There's guardian angels. So a lot of familiar stuff here if people have been brought up in popular Christianity of some sort or another. There's some free will, and there's some choice about what role you will take in the next life, which is quite interesting. So there is actually a certain amount of free will. And there's also this interesting thing about drinking from the pool of forgetting. So you forget your former lives. And, you know, the people who are a bit more base drink too much and then totally forget their former lives. So Maria wanted to bring up some themes here, which was, she sent me some notes, which was fate and destiny, about fate and destiny. The soul's end is either heaven or hell. This was out of their control and predetermined. And there's also some luck involved, right? But then there's also some freedom of choice. Each soul is free to choose their next life, and if they want to be reborn as an animal or a human. Their choice also comes with responsibility. We are responsible for the life we live and lead, and not the gods. You know, and so, you know, and this of course relates to Buddhism and karma and that sort of thing. And so I'm just looking at Maria's notes here, and she's saying that she sees this myth as bringing everything together in the Republic, especially about justice, reward, and education, and the gaining of knowledge and wisdom. If you're just, you are being rewarded not only in this life, but in the next one. Having said this, you need wisdom and philosophical training to help you choose your next life wisely. Okay, so there's also, and I haven't discussed this at all, this image that they see when they went part of the journey, the spindle of necessity. And we can talk about that a bit as well with it's revolving around. It's like a spindle for making the old-fashioned way of making a thread. And there's the 8 sirens representing the eight divisions in the octave. And there's fate singing in unison with the sirens, and so there's lots of stuff there if people are into that sort of thing. And yeah, that pretty much ends the Republic. That's the end for us. I suppose it's kind of like a myth that's sort of about justice, that certainly makes you feel good about being just and seeing that the just are rewarded. So it's an uplifting thing. And remember in the Phaedo, when we got right to the end of the Phaedo, there's a similar sort of myth that is uplifting before for Socrates as he's about to take the hemlock and die, and for his audience to help for their lamentations about his death. So there's some similarities in ending in that way. On the theme of justice, which has been the theme right through. The whole reason why, remember the justice in the soul and the justice in society. You need to have justice in the society in order for the citizens to have justice in the soul. And this is supporting the narrative of rewarding justice and promoting justice, as well as the education. So that's it, folks. Thanks for coming and going through the journey with me with the Republic. I've really enjoyed it. Every time I do it, I enjoy it. It's a marvelous book with so many dimensions to it, so much going on. And I do hope you enjoyed it as much as me, probably with different emphasis, and that's great. But it's wonderful and it's been great. And, you know, congratulations for making the effort, because it's a sort of thing that, you know, it's one of those things that is really worth doing before you die, reading a great book like this. And so we've all done that, and I hope we're all better for it. So I am going to go and grab a glass of wine, and maybe you want to do that too, or something else. And yeah, we can just have a bit of a general chat about the myth, a bit more about the myth, about the spindle of necessity, and yeah, anything else. Okay, I'll be back in a sec.
So are we going to choose our next life now that we've had some philosophical training, everybody?
I'd love to hear.
Is that going to be our reward?
Something I found curious was that Odysseus chose the life of an ordinary man. Having had, in the myth of it says that even having had a very eventful life himself, after all his experiences, he chose the life of an ordinary man for his next life. What do people think about that?
He had the 20-year journey, didn't he? And the war and everything, and he just wanted a simple life after that, an uneventful life.
Mm.
I thought he didn't choose.
Yeah,
I thought that he didn't choose.
Is that what was left over?
I think that's what he said. He was the last one. I thought he said he didn't choose anything.
Let's see.
Okay.
I can't remember.
No.
Did Air choose any life?
No, he didn't. But did Odysseus, did he choose something, Bernie?
Yeah, he did.
Oh.
Yes, he did. He did. Fuller's right. He did choose.
Yeah.
Did choose, okay.
And I was wondering how that sits with the other theme in the Republic about, you know, a higher form of reality and the philosopher king. And yet here's Odysseus choosing the life of an ordinary man for the next round.
Oh, yeah.
Well, he's been there, done that, I guess. He's probably just wants to just sit back, drink wine and fish. And being an Ithacan, I know what he'd want to do. He'd just want to sit on Ithaca. I know.
He's already arrived there.
Well,
that's it.
Well, what sort of life did, you know, if Socrates had the ideal life, he had the life of an ordinary person, didn't he? You know, so he wasn't, you know, like, I don't think, if Plato is seeing Socrates as the ideal man, his life isn't some sort of hero or anything, is it? So it kind of makes sense in that way.
I was just thinking when you mentioned, oh, sorry, who was that? I was thinking, I attended a Zoom thing the other day about pandemics, and the plague of Athens was referred to as a pandemic all those years ago. And I looked up the dates, and that happens to be about the same time when Plato was born, so certainly in Socrates' time. And when I did a little bit more reading, it seems about a third of the population died because of that pandemic, the plague of Athens. I was just wondering, with respect to, you know, writing about the soul and so forth, how that might have influenced Socrates especially and Plato subsequently, given that it occurred during their time. So I don't know, it's a pretty, I mean, we can see how it's impacted us with COVID. And however, we've got technology that brings us, you know, from all corners of the world, we know what's going on. But I don't know if that might have influenced anything back in that day. It's a wild guess.
Yeah, well, we'll see the scale of what happened. 1/3 of the population. I mean, that's the Black Death in Europe in the Middle Ages, isn't it? You know, we had nothing like that.
I don't know if that's
We
true.
just have to resort to Zoom. That's all, mostly. What's not true? You're not sure is what true?
Oh, just if it was a third, I just read that somewhere on the.
Oh, yeah, but those plagues were serious things. You know, they decimated the society. They terrorized the society. When someone gets the, you know, imagine when someone got the plague and was going to die, and you know, sometimes very fast. You know, and this was your loved one. You know, if you started caring for your loved one, you know, like immediately when you got it, it's sort of like isolation. You know, it would have been just horrible. So he had that. They had wars. They had the Peloponnesian Wars with, you know, with Sparta, and that was quite devastating for Athens. And then Athens was defeated, and Athens was sacked, and then you got the rule of the 30 tyrants. So there was a lot of trauma in his youth. You know, that we you know, our generation can't really imagine, really.
You know what I find fascinating, and I'm wondering obviously whether it's going to come up in the next or the session that involves the, you know, Plato Christianity. I find it fascinating continuously that we humans are eternally looking for the answer, you know, the afterlife answer. And obviously they were doing it in his time and probably prior to him, and will continue doing it. And we create or formulate is the word I'm looking for, various theories around what that looks like. I mean, I think his depiction in the myth of and Maria's comment about fate, you know, and destiny is quite interesting, because this whole process of, you know, souls coming from up and below and choosing again and reincarnating and moving through and making these conscious decisions and going, you know, with their like St. Peter's gates type stuff. There's lots of parallels in other, you know, religions in all different ways. Like I'm finding it incredible that we're still doing this. We will always do it, I imagine, because we don't probably really know. And we don't have the answer, and probably won't.
Well, I'm interested, Dimitri, because it's a big question for me. I mean, what is the role of these myths in Plato's dialogues? I mean, why are they there? He introduces and said, "I'm going to tell you a story now." What does that mean? You know, I'm going to tell you a story. Does that mean we believe it as literally true, as metaphorically true, as, I don't know, what is the status of this myth or myths in general? If people here have done other courses, we've read some of the other myths. You know, it's just a general question, because it's a bit of a problem for me in presenting it, by the way, because I don't know where to pitch that. You know, because he says, it's a myth, guys. It's a myth I'm telling now. The other stuff's not a myth. And it's hard to know because, of course, you know, myth was basically the general form education and stories, and that Plato and the philosophers were the first to step away from educating in that way. So whereas for us now, when we say myth, it's sort of really distinctly distant, separated from the way we educate, except through studying literature, you know, going doing English or Greek literature course or whatever. But I'm interested in other people's view. What's going on? Why are these myths here?
I mean, I see them as a way of telling a complicated idea in a simple way. So, because what is being raised in a myth is similar to the sorts of parables that we have in the Bible, that they're essentially there to educate us with regard to, you know, the good life, or the you know, or the virtues, let's say. So, because is anyone familiar with the original story of Pinocchio, when it was sort of told by, if anybody gets a chance to have a look at Pinocchio and read the original version of Pinocchio, it is quite a brutal story. So there are some very harsh truths that are being told there, and they talk about the fact that this was a story that was meant to educate children in the, you know, sort of harsh realities of life. So, you know, Pinocchio's conscience, you know, Jiminy Cricket in Disney is Pinocchio crushes his conscience very early in the story, and you know, you're hearing a very sort of you know, like a child's story, but it is in fact, you know, full of all sorts of underlying you know, truth and I don't know, so something that sort of makes you stop and think more about what it is that you're reading. I mean, just like Aesop's fables, they're also sort of these fascinating ways of retelling some of our sort of very sort of simple truths about ourselves.
And then I don't know what your experience, Nick, and people here, because you might have had a different upbringing than myself, but in Australia, if people here went to Australian primary schools, and my parents as well, Grimm's fairy tales and Mother Goose Cuts and fairy tales and stuff, which everyone knows, we all got modified, sanitized versions of them. And when I was a bit older and went and read them, I thought, oh my God, you know, these are not fit for children. But of course they were for children, and they were for children in their harshness. So yeah, that's an interesting thing. Yeah, anyone else got any ideas on these myths, how to read them?
Yeah, I had always assumed that myths were sort of on the level of art, in that they were sort of this pure form or pure way to communicate some truth. And it's really only in modern times that the term myth has come to now be used as a falsehood, but in actual fact, it was really about the communication of some eternal truth.
And it's kind of something that has been picked up with Nietzsche, you know, in modern times with Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the first in modern times to pick it up. And then Freud actually learned a lot from Nietzsche with that stuff. I don't know whether people have heard of the you know, the Oedipus complex or whatever, you know, how Freud used Oedipus. So the story of Oedipus, where he kills his father and marries his mother, or has sex with his mother or whatever. And uses that, Freud uses that in a particular way to talk about this tension in the son, with the repressed love for the mother and hatred for the father as competition, that sort of thing. So you can get an eternal truth out of that. And we've probably seen, you know, with with writing about literature and ancient literature, various stories like that, not just Freud or Nietzsche or whatever. So there's that going on. I just wanted to maybe draw a distinction between, in Plato, between the allegories, like the allegory of the cave and the divided line and stuff, where he says, I'm going to tell this in a figure. It seems to be that they are different from where he says, I'm going to tell this story or this myth or this fable. And, you know, let's say the fables of the afterlife. And you know, just relating that to where he says earlier in the Republic about we need noble lies. And remember, the example of the noble lie there was the gold people, the silver people, and the bronze people. That three classes. You know, the bronze people are the common people, and the gold people are the guardians, and I think the silver people are the military auxiliary. So and so that's like, we're going to tell this lie to promote goodwill and to promote the society. Basically, we're going to tell propaganda that promotes the structure of our society. So yeah, I don't know. I think we can kind of separate out a bit, like the allegory of the cave is saying, I'm going to tell this in a figure. This noble lie to promote, you know, the just and stability within the society, and then you know, probably similar are these myths like the myth of error, but yeah, maybe they're all the same.
You know that we need, sorry, just a real quick one. We need noble lies. It reminds me of the sort of leadership question or issue of how you take people along. You know, a leader might take people along with them. They need a story or a phrase or that leadership. And if it's for the purposes of good, then, you know, we will wear it. But if it's not, and that's where the problems, you know, arise, it moves into a different altered state. I'm sorry I interrupted someone.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I'm just thinking of it as, you know, when we talk in the third person, it depersonalises it. So we're not being told directly, this is how it is. It's sort of like, it's an ideal, or it's like when we talk in the third person. And so we're being drawn along to living a better life, but we're not being told directly, this is how this society or you have to do it. That's just what I'm thinking.
Yeah, that's an important aspect of what a myth, isn't it? Yeah, it's kind of like it's a step removal, so you can look at it from the outside. Yeah.
And it's a better way of probably leading people to, rather than telling them, even though we're probably just doing it as well indirectly.
Yeah.
Where we are being led, but we're not really personalising it or getting upset over it. We're just doing it sort of thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So Bernie, sorry, can you just, so are you saying that you know, the story of the cave, the parable of the cave, is a story of higher order than you know, the myth of for instance, so that there is a higher truth to be found within? Is that what you're kind of alluding to?
Well, not so much. It is, in fact, that. I mean, he is saying, oh, this higher truth, it's beyond being, it's beyond knowing. I can only tell you in a figure, you know, in an image, and only tell you the offspring. I can't actually, even as an image, as a showing, let alone saying what it is, I can only show you in a figure its offspring. I can't show you it directly itself. And then he goes into using the allegory. So that allegory, in fact, is about a higher truth. That's true. But it's also presented differently, isn't it? Because in the one in the Phaedo, and in this one with the myth of it says, hey, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a story. And he doesn't, I don't know, I feel like it's presented differently. He's not saying, that it's leading to a higher truth or anything. I'm reflecting and thinking maybe I'm drawing a distinction that's not there. Don't know what other people.
But I think most of us felt there was a greater resonance with within ourselves of the allegory of the cave and the divided line, whereas perhaps we don't feel that resonance as strongly with other, with, say, in this case, the myth of I just sort of felt a great sort of resonance with the allegory of the cave in that I sort of thought that it alluded to, I think as Demetra questioned, like our search for a higher, for an answer to, the reason why we're here, that I got a greater sense of an explanation, let's say, from the allegory of the cave.
Well, I say to you, Nick, speak for yourself. Other people have a very high resonance with these stories, and other people through history have. These stories have become very powerful, and we can't say absolutely, but if we look at these stories going through Hellenistic, and we will talk about this in Plato and Christianity if everyone does it. If we see these stories going through Hellenistic culture and then re-emerging within Christianity, there's so many similarities that it's kind of difficult to say that they aren't in the same tradition. So they have in our tradition resonated very strongly with people. Maybe for us in our secular atheistic society,
Yes.
for some of us, the allegory of the cave continues to have a resonance, which these other stories kind of just have slipped back into the background.
True. Yeah, no, I know.
I'm being provocative.
I am coming from a very from an atheistic perspective, I guess.
Yeah, well, an atheistic perspective doesn't necessarily mean you're atheistic. I think our I like to say it, our modern perspective is actually atheistic, even if we're believers, compared to the Middle Ages, compared to 200 years ago. Some of us just have no idea how strongly the whole culture and everything was surrounded by belief in a way that it is not now. And we can all step out of that view and look at it, what we might say from an atheistic or secular, I don't know what a better word is, or sociological, where you see it as a religion as a sociological phenomenon. It was very difficult in the past for people to see it in that way. So there is I think there is a difference there. I might say actually, and the way it was revived in the West through Machiavelli in particular, he revived it from Roman culture, from Livy and various other Roman writers. So that secularism, that secular or atheistic perspective, was also there fairly strongly in ancient cultures as well. But there are times in ancient cultures and in medieval and recent Western, European culture where it wasn't there, just wasn't there.
Bernie, do you mean that, I think in what I understood you saying, that there's our society is not, it's secular and atheistic more so than people, something about people believing, that you said people believe in this society. I thought there was a bit of a contradiction there.
Okay, well, let me put it this way. We can have a discussion about behavior, ethics or beliefs or whatever, whether they are good or bad or true or false, right? So we can have that discussion, and we've always been able to have that discussion in all cultures, whether it's good or bad, whether it's true or false. But this discussion that we often also have is the way a belief as a sociological phenomenon, as a power in itself, as a, you know, we talk about a religion with a distance, a belief with a distance that reinforces, we say bourgeois ideology. You know, it's like Thrasymachus. You know, Plato's trying to bring us out of this, where bourgeois ideology reinforces, supports the benefits of that group in society, the bourgeois. So the Marxist sort of thing, saying that all these beliefs and ethics and stuff support the powerful, the Thrasymachus Marxist sort of argument. For a lot of times in society, it was very difficult to talk in that way, to talk in that sociological sort of way, to look at ideas in terms of their psychosocial effect, not in terms of whether they're true or false or good or bad. A lot of times it can only be whether it's true or false or good or bad. You think of, like, we see that in fundamentalism, perhaps. You know, we call it fundamentalism, but there's been times in our history when everyone was a fundamentalist. Yeah.
But I think if you regard, sorry.
Before we go on, did anyone else get a glass of wine, or is this a kind of a bit of a teetotaling? So I think we usually toast Plato. So if anyone has got a glass,
toast to Bernie for being an incredibly inspiring teacher and challenging at times, but it's very stimulating. Toast to Bernie.
And to the group.
And to a great group and a great dialogue.
Okay.
Can I mention something about the myths?
Yeah,
that's
sure.
Okay. I just think maybe it was, I mean, we've got Greek mythology, as you said, the Hellenistic culture and traditions, Bernie, and that would have been important language at the time. You know, that would have been a narrative that people at the time could have actually, it would have resonated for them to have messages packed into the myths. But think also of the Dreamtime mythology of our First Nations people, the oldest living culture on the world, that it's actually a belief system around the earth and the place of human beings on the earth and creation, which actually have a parallel with Greek mythology too. So I think myths are myths, fairy tales, they are powerful stories around the human condition, and they actually include all the forms. They include justice, injustice, good, bad, all the one. What is the one? What is, I think they've, all those, the forms that Plato refers to are actually encapsulated in the mythology. If you actually look into it, just some comments and thoughts that were going on within me anyhow, when you were having that discussion.
Yeah, well, we kind of have these Greeks to blame for moving out of that, like mythological forms of education, storytelling and cultural development is the norm. It's these bloody Greeks, who changed all that, really. I mean, it is, these ancient Greeks, it wasn't just Plato, but...
And you mean brought in maths and science?
Well, brought in maths and science, but also just brought in prose, for example, just prose. And Aristotle, more than Plato, Aristotle just saying this is what is, and, reasoning and reasoning the truth, and Euclid writing his elements, and, that's a long way from Euclid's elements of geometry is a long way from myth, isn't it? So
it's a little bit like the tension between fiction and non-fiction as well, or literature versus factual learning. Would you say that's a bit of a...
Well, there was only literature. I mean, you could say, it's oral. So I don't know what there was only in the and the First Nations stuff. You could say that there was only literature and not written. And in ancient Greece, before these philosophers, there was only literature, there was only legend, there was only myth. They just introduced this. They introduced this new thing, and we're coming in by reading Plato right at the beginning of all this, the beginning of writing in prose, the beginning of working things out by reason in this really methodical sort of way, and the first development of the mathematical sciences, which we presume now, and we all accept, you know, we all accept that that they've worked out when the next eclipse is going to be and whatever by all the mathematics, because it's all worked out. You know, we just accept that the mathematics is going to work it out for us. Things that, you know, I'm not talking about sophisticated things, just things that we always presume. So, so yeah, it's all new, and it's all being introduced by Plato. So that's a bit tricky in reading him, because he's introducing something new, and we're kind of living in that. You know, we're living in that, where our culture's accepted that for thousands, you know, well, certainly for hundreds of years.
Yeah, when you think of it, it's so radical for that time in that sense. But it's universal, and it's so relevant to our times now, and particularly, as Sue pointed out, and yourself as well, that there were plagues at that time, that there were wars, that there were tyrannies, and in a way that, and in the city-state of Athens, but now it's like the world, we're experiencing worldwide as well, all those issues. So it's even more relevant to us now in terms of the messages that are imparted. That's why, you know, I, as you said, it's important we read this before we die and pass on. But whilst you went and got your wine, I cracked a joke that, are we going to choose our next life now? Because we've had some philosophical education, and we're philosophical beings through your tutoring.
Yeah. Take up geometry. Become a geometer.
I did Nabil's course last Saturday, and I experienced a roadblock by the fourth design.
Oh,
and
tell us
that was
about that. A roadblock.
Yeah.
Was your hand frozen mid cycle in drawing a circle?
Yes, my circles just became chaos. There was no rhyme or reason.
Look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording. And it is because I know some people need to rush off, and it's kind of don't want people to fade away, but I'll just stop the recording and